So my first question that I was going to kind of pose to you, what does cinematic look like to you? And there's no right or wrong answer. This is something that I hear a lot. You know, young people that I work with are like, oh, I want to make it look cinematic. Or maybe I have a client that's doing a commercial and they're like, we need it to look very cinematic. So that's my question for you all. What does cinematic look like to you? And it could be different for everyone, and there's no right or wrong answer. I think I was thinking about what my answer to this would be too, and that was part of it. Is it's subtle. It's like to me, something that's cinematic is when you are so immersed in the story that you don't even think about, oh, there was a camera there, or oh, there was lights there. You just kind of like everything feels so real that you kind of just get lost in the story and the realism, and not even think about how it was made. So the reason I put this picture on here on this opening slide was this was a movie that was Inception, and I guess I liked the movie. It was all right. It was, you know, it was cool. It was interesting, but I had the DVD, and I was already working in like photography and video, and I have to say I probably watched the making of this movie about 10 times. I think I only watched the movie twice. And even before that, just me personally, I am so much more like interested in how movies are made sometimes than the actual movie themselves. And so that's just for me personally. I really gravitate towards how things are done, especially in Hollywood. It's so amazing and so big, and they have these crazy, huge ideas that they're able to put together. So that's me. I like movies. Okay, I really love seeing how things are done, how movies are made, and so I think that's part of why I gravitated towards like camera and lighting, and so I'm going to share a couple pieces that I've worked on, and one of the things, so I do, I'll get a little more into this, but I do a lot of commercial work. And one of the things that I've noticed recently is there's this really interesting like merge of like cinematic storytelling, narrative storytelling, combined with like documentary, combined with commercial. And those worlds that were all kind of one distinct thing at one time have all kind of like merged into one. And so I've worked on a couple of these like pseudo commercials, but they really take on a lot more than a commercial. They're more of a storytelling kind of documentary. So the first one I was going to share is, let's see, hopefully this will play. So this one is actually we'll call it a commercial for a company called Frame.io. You may be familiar with them, but they were acquired by Adobe a couple years back. It's a service that allows people to share video, especially when they're working on like a project, like editing it, and you're able to give feedback. You know, so you could have 100 people all around the country, and they can all be giving you feedback on your video. They can add notes, they can put little things in there. So anyways, this was a project that I was involved with even before this piece was put together. A good friend of mine started this company called V-Speed, and I come from a world of doing like helicopter cameras, putting cameras on helicopters. He came to me and said, I want to put a camera on a high-speed jet, and I want to go fly and pitch this project to Disney and to National Geographic, and we can fly this jet. Hey Rigo, welcome. There's a little paper there on your way, and you can grab one of those. Welcome. You're just getting started. So anyways, so this was a project that was shot for National Geographic and Walt Disney called America the Beautiful. It's a natural history documentary, and I helped them I would kind of I helped them build out the jet, provided like cameras and lenses, everything for this platform. But this platform was used on this documentary, and then this company Frame.io, which is one of the companies we used to do some of the post work on it, came to us and said, hey, could we shoot a piece showing how you used Frame.io on this documentary? And so that's what this is. That's what I'm going to share with you today. This is a little behind the scenes kind of taste of what this documentary looked like in production, and then how we used Frame.io to kind of share the work as it was being shot. So you get to see the jet flying around. We actually filmed this in Oregon here. All the shots of the jet taking off and landing, we filmed in McMinnville at the airport there. We filmed some of it at Mount Hood. And then the shots of the jet inside the hangar, that was shot in Hillsboro. So.
In the camera, I know that these are images that nobody has ever seen before.
They're high enough to give you a sense of overview, but fast enough that the landscape just develops and comes to life.
We're built from the ground up, and that entire time of growth has been with Frame.io. V-Speed was founded to tell stories that would be impossible to tell any other way. Easily our most exciting project to date is a Disney Plus original called America the Beautiful.
We were contacted by National Geographic asking us if we'd like to do a Planet Earth of North America. We initially thought, how are we going to make the most famous landscapes on the planet look fresh? We needed a new tool, and this is where the V-Speed jet came into play.
We needed a system faster than a helicopter.
We realized that if we wanted to do this and we wanted to do it the right way, we were going to need to build our own. And so the L39 with a camera on it was born.
It is a really nimble, fun airplane to fly.
We use Frame.io to rapidly catalog and assess where we are at in the storytelling process.
Having that ability to constantly review shots, know when we got a shot, know when we could move on, those are key things which allowed us to keep the budget down.
That's coming. Good. That's a wrap.
One of the shots that we had suggested for America the Beautiful that would show some
You guys hear this okay?
drama of Great Plains weather was to film a tornado.
There are a lot of people that have photographed tornadoes from the ground, but nobody has captured one from the air in a jet.
The FAA will tell you if there's a thunderstorm out there, steer clear by 20 miles.
So we got ourselves on target, found a beautiful updraft in exactly the right phase of the storm life cycle.
And we got to see something that actually, I don't know if anybody's seen it from that angle.
I remember getting a call saying, there's something coming to a Frame.io near you soon. And I was just sitting there waiting, thinking, oh God.
Kind of scary to upload this clip.
I just remember dragging through that clip the first time.
And then the comment comes in,
Holy cow, they have actually nailed it. And I was able to call National Geographic and say, we got your tornado.
Obvious highlight of a career.
I think what a lot of these V-Speed shots hopefully will show people is how much left there still is to fight for. It really is pretty special out there still.
I have no idea how we would have filmed this show without Frame.io. We were able to ultimately upload extremely high quality proxies securely over cellular networks and get feedback on that instantly. We are putting cameras in places they've never been, and we're creating perspectives that nobody's ever seen, and now everybody gets to.
So that was our Frame.io commercial. So you can see, I wanted to share that because I just thought it was a unique kind of peek behind the scenes of some of what I've been involved with, but also just in the fact that this is how commercials, can potentially look today, given the the landscape of YouTube and be able to share things online. The commercials are no longer just a 15 or 30-second spot that comes up on your TV. So, and I do have another one I'll share a little later. I was just going to share a little bit about myself for those who don't know me. So I have several companies within the industry. This picture, first of all, this was actually one of my classes at George Fox. So I adjunct teach one class a semester at George Fox University. Rigo, who just showed up here, is one of my students. He was in my class this spring. Got to shoot a really amazing music video and a commercial, actually kind of a documentary commercial in another class. So yeah. This was on the set of a music video that we shot last spring at George Fox University. But my main like full-time job is I own a company called Via Films. It's VIA Films, and we do specialty camera. So what you just saw, with some of the aerial work, that's one of the specialties that we do is aerial, primarily helicopter aerials. A little bit of drone as well. We do automotive work. So we have several automotive rigs, like camera cars, Polaris, like all-terrain vehicles that we'll mount cameras to. And those are typically used to shoot car commercials, things like that. And then high speed is the other specialty niche. So cameras that shoot high frame rates for like ultra slow motion. And so that's the other niche. So those are kind of my three niches within the industry. And I would consider myself a director of photography or a camera op, and a specialty camera op specifically. So the other company that I'm partners in is called Motorized Precision. We make camera robots. So these are like robotic arms that you can program to move cameras in very quick, specific, repeatable ways. And I'll share a little bit about that as well. So like I mentioned, I'm also adjunct at George Fox University, so I teach one class there per semester. And I teach camera and lighting in the fall, which is part of their cinematic arts curriculum. And what we're going to kind of talk about today kind of comes straight from camera and lighting. So that's kind of our focus today is camera and lighting, and a lot of that comes from that class that I teach there. I have my wife Stacy and I have 4 kids. We live just outside of Dundee. I have 2 sons at George Fox University, and my 2 daughters are at C.S. Lewis Academy here in town. We go to Red Hills Church. That's how I know Ashley and how I got connected with Creative Tides. And besides that, I like film, photography, specifically like art photography has kind of been one of my hobbies and passions through my whole life since like high school and even before. I really enjoy doing stock photography as well, which is basically going out and shooting what I want to do for fun and then finding someone to license the shot to. So I submit stock photos through several different websites that license those photos for commercials and things like that. I love learning about filmmaking. I love learning new things, watching behind the scenes of films and learning how something was done. I'm constantly like looking for like what's a new technology or what's a new way to take an old technology and bring it to today's world. I like travel and architecture and design. So that's kind of a little bit about me. This is kind of a spreadsheet, if you will, of all the people that work on a movie set, basically. And the reason I show this is, and it may be hard to see, but I have kind of outlined here in blue, this is the camera department. And that's kind of where we're going to focus today. And this structure is, still used in large feature films, and it can expand to many times this size. But today we're gonna just focus on camera department. That's kind of my specialty is camera department. And within the time we have, we don't really have time to get into all these different departments. So basically the camera department is the director of photography, also known as the cinematographer or DP. That person answers to the director who's here and then leads this whole team of other people down there. So as the director of photography or the DP, you are leading, this is camera, and this is our electrical, which is our lighting and our gear, and then this is grip department. So, of course, camera, within that, we're dealing with cameras. I brought some cameras here for us to look at, and I have some camera things to go over as well. Within the camera department, we have a camera operator, a first assistant camera, and a second assistant camera. And so those are typically your camera team. If you're on a shoot with multiple cameras, usually there's those positions on each camera. Usually you have 3 people on each camera. You have an operator, a first assistant camera, and a second assistant camera on each of those cameras. So, and we can get a little bit, when we go look at the cameras, I can kind of explain a little bit about what each of those people would do, especially on a camera like this. I brought 2 cameras. This is the cinema camera. You can see there's a lot of, it's big, there's a lot of things to it. All of those 3 people each have roles when they're working with a camera like that. This other camera here, this is more of the video camera setup. And this would probably be something that you would typically use more for like a documentary or a smaller size production. And a camera like this would be typically operated by a single operator who would be like a camera op, but they're also doing their own focus and their everything else with the camera. And then our electrical or lighting department, that's led by someone who's called the gaffer. He leads that department, and they're in charge of everything electrical and lighting. So they're dealing with cables, how to get power to the lights, and what kind of lights they're using. They're working with the director of photography on what's the lighting going to look like, and what are we trying to do with the lighting. So that's our gaffer. And then grip. So grip works closely with the camera team and the lighting team. They're kind of like the handyman on set. They do everything that revolves around putting a camera or a light somewhere. So whether a camera has to be mounted to a car, or it's going on a dolly, or it's going up in the rafters somewhere, they're the ones that are doing all that rigging. They're also working with the lighting department on rigging lights. Not all lights are always just on a simple stand. They can go up anywhere, and so the grips are dealing with putting cameras, putting lighting, rigging, all those things, different places. So the key grip is the head of that department, and then under the key grip, there's usually multiple other grips depending on the size and scope of the project. So that's just a quick rundown of like kind of what the camera department looks like, and that's primarily what we'll be focusing on today, is just those roles within that camera department. So obviously that doesn't include everything. There's quite a few things that aren't included. Is there anything that stands out to you like that's not included in the camera department that maybe you thought would be part of the camera department? One thing is audio. Audio is like over here somewhere. It's not actually part of the camera department. It is something that, like, if you're a YouTube creator or if you're a single camera op on a documentary, you're definitely going to be dealing with audio. If you're working on a bigger production, that audio is kind of a whole separate department, and you're typically not dealing with any of that. Down here in green is all post-production. So again, as a director of photography or someone that works in a camera department, you're usually not doing anything in post-production. But again, if you're doing YouTube videos or if you're making a small commercial, local commercial, you're probably touching on every single one of those roles, and you just don't even know it. So that's kind of my world. My world is this little L here is that camera department. I don't typically do a lot with audio. I typically don't do a lot of post-production editing in my work. Not because I don't love it or think it's important, but the bigger the shoot gets, usually the less one person is doing, the more you're kind of like specializing on one thing. Okay, so I kind of broke this up into 3 sections today. We have camera stuff, we have lighting stuff, and then we have camera movement and composition. So understanding your camera is more about like camera settings and camera, how it's like before the camera starts rolling, what kind of things you want to think about. And I have a few topics, and what I'm going to go through is like how does each one of these things, they might start to sound very technical, and there's all these things you have to think about. My hoping is maybe one of these ideas you'll come away with and say, you know what, like I'm just shooting on my phone, but I can still take that one idea away, and it's something I can use. Okay, so I brought several different cameras today, and there's just a few basic kinds I can kind of explain quickly. So this, kind of one of the, besides a phone, the most basic camera, a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. You see a couple more of them back there. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about. Technically, this is not a DSLR. A DSLR has a mirror in it, and you're actually looking through the lens. The mirror flips up when it takes a picture. But those terms have kind of become a little interchangeable. So DSLR, a lot of people just call this a DSLR or mirrorless camera. So this is your most basic camera. These typically are both stills cameras and movie cameras or video cameras. Super common. They've gotten so good in quality that you can really do a lot with a camera like this. The second tier of cameras that are kind of, and there's such a range. Cameras can just kind of like run the gamut of anywhere from a phone to this or somewhere in between. This camera is a Sony FX6. This is what I would call your typical video camera. It doesn't take still photos, although you could pull stills from it. But ergonomically, it's kind of set up for video production. This kind of camera would typically be used on documentaries. It's a very, very popular camera for documentaries, to commercials, to a variety of other things. It's kind of designed to be used by a single operator. I'd say the differences between these two, so if you're going from something like this to something like this, it's image quality wise, there's not a huge difference. This is actually the same sensor in here, so same sensor that would be in this camera. What you're really getting with a camera like this is the ergonomics of has a lot more buttons on it. So when you're operating a video camera, you can click buttons and change things and do things with it. Whereas this camera probably has most of those settings, but they're buried somewhere in the menus here, and you have to scroll through all the little menus and stuff. So really, it comes down to more of the layout of the functions. It also does have a flip-out screen rather than a fixed screen on the back, so this can be moved around different places. Two other things that this type of camera would have that this doesn't is professional outputs for professional video outputs, so SDI outputs that would go out to your typical like wireless video systems or a professional monitor. These cameras typically they have HDMI, which is more of a prosumer connector. So these have SDI out. The other thing that I really like about this camera over a DSLR is the filters. It has internal filters, which you can turn on here and run through the filters there. These are neutral density filters. So these cut the amount of light that's coming into the camera. And so we'll get into a little bit of that, of like settings for cameras and why that might be important to be able to cut the light that's coming into your camera. With a camera like this, you would have to physically screw on a filter on the front in order to add a filter to it, where this has internal filters built into it. These are the cameras that we use at George Fox, the Cinematic Arts Department. We just invested in 6 of these cameras this recent year. And so Rigo's got to use these on a lot of his projects. And it's just become a very great camera for kind of a little bit of everything. And so, and then moving our way up, there's several different things in between these two, but this is what I would call this a cinema camera. This would be a typical, this camera is a Arri Alexa 35 camera. And so this camera is pretty much used on, I would say, the majority of films and television that's shot today. There's a few other popular cameras as well, but this is probably the most popular. I would say about 50% of high-end productions that are being shot today are shot on this camera. I think for me, like I said, the sensor-wise, the look and quality is very similar between all three of these cameras. Huge price difference between these cameras, but this camera can take almost as good a picture as this camera. So, I mean, what's the difference? Why would I call this a cinema camera and not this one? Any ideas of like what would justify this? Why do people want to shoot on this camera instead of this?
More bells and whistles.
Yeah?
Creative capability.
That's kind of two-pronged. So it's almost the opposite of what you're saying there, bells and whistles. So, which actually leads to what you can do with it creatively. So this camera does not have any autofocus whatsoever. Both of these cameras have autofocus as an option if you want to use it. This one is completely manual. So less bells and whistles, but adds to the creativity. You can, of course, use these cameras manually as well, but typically with a camera like this, your first assistant camera, your first AC, is having to manually pull focus. These systems also, they make a wireless version of this as well, where your person who's controlling focus is off camera. They're able to change focus that way. I think just the fact that these don't have autofocus really leads to that creativity element. When you're changing focus on a camera like this, you're thinking about it. Like, why are we changing focus? How quickly are we changing focus? Where does the focus land, and then where does it go next? And so it's just more complexity, and you're slowing down more. You're thinking about those kind of things. So again, another thing, this camera does not have any auto exposure, where both these cameras also have auto exposure. So less features. Sorry, there are some cool things about this camera, but less features. No auto exposure at all. It doesn't have a light meter in it. It doesn't set any of your settings automatically. Those all have to be done completely manual. So another reason why this can actually work in the favor of the crew creatively is because those are things that the crew is having to think about. And that's why there's more people typically when they're operating a camera like this, because there's several crew members who are kind of working together and deciding what's our focus doing, what does our exposure look like. So yeah, besides those features that it doesn't have, it does have a really great eyepiece viewfinder, which these ones don't. This has a little pop-up screen, but this has a really nice viewfinder you can actually put your eye up to and see, which is really nice. This camera is really designed to replace a film camera. It's really designed in a way that like a film camera of 20, 30 years ago was laid out and how it worked. The eyepiece, the type of lens mount it has, and just like the accessories that it works with are all accessories that we've worked with on cameras for 20, 30 years. So and front here, this is a matte box. This takes filters. This camera also does have those built-in neutral density filters as well, but you can add actual glass filters to the front there. You can also use this to shade your light, keep light from hitting the lens. This camera also does have a lot of ports. All these connectors here allow you to power multiple things. You can have this camera, even though it probably looks pretty intimidating with all the things that are attached to it, this is a pretty tame camera build as far as movie goes. Typical cameras might have 5 or 6 other accessories attached to it, doing different things. All those things have to be powered. You got power ports for all those things. You have multiple video out signals. You have multiple ways to bring power into the camera. And so with some of these cameras, in order to do those kinds of things, to have all those video connectors going in and out, all these power options coming in and out, you would have to add, extra boxes to the back of these things. And then they end up being just as big and cumbersome as this one by the time you're there. So later on, I want everyone to have an opportunity to come up here and change some settings and play around with these cameras a little bit. Okay, so that's a little bit about cameras. Lenses. So lenses can really kind of run the gamut. Your basic lens, this is a chart that shows the focal length of lenses. So obviously you have wide angle lenses, you have telephoto lenses, and kind of everything in between. Two basic kinds of lenses that you'll see as far as focal length will be a zoom lens. So this is a zoom lens on here, allows you to zoom in and out. This one is a 28 to 70 millimeter zoom. So the smaller the number, the wider the lens is. So 28 millimeters on this lens is our wide setting, and then 70 is our telephoto setting. So allows you to zoom in between those. The lens here on this camera is a prime, called a prime lens, which means it's just a fixed focal length. It has a single field of view, it doesn't change. You're not able to zoom in and zoom out with it. And so prime lenses like this usually come in a set. This particular set is 7 different focal lengths of lenses. 19 millimeter being the widest lens, and then a 100 millimeter being the most telephoto, the smallest field of view. So again, kind of comes back to this. This seems very slow and very cumbersome to have to take this lens off, put a different lens on to just change your focal length. Whereas with this one, you can just quickly turn the dial, and there you go. You have a different focal length. But there's definitely something special about using prime lenses. Again, it comes back to slowing down, thinking about what focal length makes sense, rather than just quickly, let's just zoom in here. What focal length are we going to use? Where does it make sense to put the camera with that given focal length? I think with a setup like this, you're definitely taking your time and you're thinking through those things a little bit more. Any questions on the camera, lenses? I know this is super quick. We spend a couple weeks at Fox usually just like intro to cameras and lenses, and there's so much more to it. Of course, there's every lens has a different purpose and storytelling. But any questions here? Yeah.
Like the lens, a 35 millimeter compared to 180.
Mm-hmm.
180 is like 5 times 35. Does that mean it's like 5 times the zoom, or is there?
So so the way that the focal lengths of lenses work, it actually, as you get more telephoto, like a bigger number makes less difference, if that makes sense. As you get wider, it's a much more difference. So if you're going, say you go from a really wide lens, like a 24 millimeter lens, to a 20 millimeter, it's only technically 4 millimeters difference. But that 24 to 20 is quite a wider field of view. Whereas if you went from, say, 100 millimeter to a 104, that's a really, really small difference. So the scale it's not like linear, I guess. It becomes much more pronounced on the wide end as you go wider. So I mentioned the specialty lenses. So as you get to these extreme focal lengths, they become very, very specialty lenses. So like an extreme wide angle lens, like a 10 millimeter lens, you're not going to find that in a zoom. That's going to have to be a prime single lens. And same thing with the other end. If you get to these extremely long focal lengths, like 600 millimeter, 1,000 millimeters, a lot of times those are just single prime lenses that are just for that one thing. There's trade-offs for quality with zooms. They make zooms that are great these days. But the equivalent prime is always going to be a little sharper. and usually look a little better, like have some better characteristics, because it's designed to just do one thing really well, just that focal length. Whereas a zoom, there's got to be some compromises in the way that they build the lens. One of the things between primes and zooms is we'll get to this as well, is the amount of light that comes into the camera. So a zoom lens typically zoom lenses are about a T28 or a f2.8 lens. And that's the amount of light that's coming into the camera. With a prime, you're able to let about 2 to 3 times more light. You can have a lens that is a lot brighter and lets a lot more light into the camera with a prime lens, typically. So question, we'll go over the last one here. Besides field of view, so we talked a little bit about how a lens would affect your field of view. How do you think a lens could affect your storytelling? Besides just being like, oh, we're going to have a wide lens, we're going to have a really tight lens, how could the choice of your lens affect how you're telling the story? Any ideas?
I guess maybe a wider lens would help you kind of see a big picture. Where when something's tightened, you feel like you're like right up front with whatever the subject is.
Yeah, and it can narrow your focus down to a single thing. If you're on a wide lens, you're seeing how this subject interacts with its environment, maybe. And if you're looking through it in a telephoto lens, maybe you're just seeing the subject and not really seeing much of their environment, but maybe it's more emotional because you're seeing, you're seeing their eyes and their face and their lips and the way they're moving a little more with a telephoto lens. Again, we spend about a week going over this at Fox, but for those of you who've done some photography, this is pretty standard stuff, and we're talking about exposure. So exposure is the amount of light that's coming in and hitting your film or your sensor in your camera. So that's your exposure. And there's several things, all these things in the triangle here will affect your exposure. But more than that, more than just your exposure, each of these things will also change the look of your image. So the three parts of the exposure triangle are aperture, which is the opening, the iris of the lens. It opens and closes, letting more or less light in. And the aperture is in a scale. Typically, they call it a f-stop. So it's a scale. In cinema lenses, sometimes it's in what they call t-stops, but they're about the same. They typically go from a number like a 2.8, like I mentioned before. That would be your wide opening. That's letting as much light in as possible. Typically, they go down to maybe like a f22, which is a very tiny aperture, letting a very small amount of light in. So that's one function of your aperture that kind of contributes to your exposure is how wide, how small is your f-stop, is your aperture on your lens. The other side of the exposure triangle over there is the shutter speed. So what that is how long your photo is being exposed to light. So, and that's measured in fractions of a second typically. So a typical shutter speed might be, 1/50th of a second, 1/60th of a second. And maybe a high shutter speed might be 1/1000th of a second. Or a really slow shutter speed might be 1/2 of a second. So that's another way that your exposure is affected, is by how long your shutter is open, how long it's exposed to light. And so, again, that also directly impacts, besides the exposure, impacts the way your image looks as well. The bottom part of the exposure triangle is your ISO. And you guys all may be familiar with that, but if you aren't, your ISO is the sensitivity of your film or sensor. So back in the old days when we were using a film camera like that, we had specific film stocks, and they maybe were ISO 400 or 800 or 100. So an ISO 100 film is a relatively slow film, it's not very sensitive to light. Moving up on the scale, like an ISO 800 film would be more sensitive. It's 4 times more sensitive to light. So that's the third part of this that affects your exposure. So between our aperture, our shutter, and our ISO, all those things contribute to how much exposure is hitting your sensor or your film. So with each of those things, though, you have creative choices, and this is for me what makes photography so fun and so interesting is having that control over all of those things and what that gives you in your final picture. So can anyone explain what a wide aperture versus a small aperture would do for our picture? So on this scale, we have a 1.4 to 1 f/16. So besides the amount of light it's letting in, what changes when we change our aperture? Does anyone know? What's in focus? Okay. I would say partially right.
Well, a
You're
1.4 is
yes.
going to have a very
Narrow depth of field. Yes.
Right. So,
So,
when you
yes,
select things,
exactly.
they're going to
You're-
be in focus, where an
perfect.
F16 is going to be
Yeah.
a lot is in focus.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. So it narrows your depth of field. So you have, of course, your lens can be focused back and forth to move your focus to where you want it, but the amount of things that are in focus. So yeah, for example, like at 1.4, maybe my depth of field is only 2 inches deep. So when I focus on Rigo, you just see his face in focus. Everything in front of him, everything in behind him is completely out of focus. But then as you go to f/16 or f/22, now maybe our depth of field is 6 feet deep. And so now maybe he's in focus, but the person behind him are also in focus. So yeah, so exactly, that's what our aperture, besides the amount of light that's coming in, affects the depth of field. How much is in focus there? Does that make sense? This is kind of like photography 101, the basics of photography. And then, so shutter speed, besides allowing light in and dictating how much light is coming in and hitting the sensor, what else, what would shutter speed do for your image? Any ideas? So imagine a half a second exposure versus a 1,000th of a second exposure. What do you think that would change? Besides the amount of light that's going to come in and expose the sensor, what else might it change? Any ideas? Action. Yeah, so anything moving is going to look different, right? So if you're using a slow shutter speed, half a second, and I'm walking by the camera, I'm going to be completely blurred. If it's a 1,000th of a second exposure, I'm going to be completely froze in that moment because it's only exposing 1/1000th of a second. So in still photography, typically like a 1/1000th of a second would be a setting that you might use for sports photography. You want to freeze the action. You want to get the basketball player jumping and they're frozen in motion, right? Whereas a shutter speed like a half a second, that might be something you would do for an effect where you want a car's lights blurring in the background as it goes by. So those would be examples in still photography where you might want to use your shutter speed creatively, depending on what you want your photo to look like. In motion, we're a little more limited on our shutter speed. And the reason why we're limited is because we're taking a certain number of photos every single second. So if you think about it, if we're shooting 24 pictures every single second, how can you expose for longer than 1/24th of a second? And so in cinematography, there's kind of a rule, and they call it the 180-degree rule. And basically, what they've found for natural-looking motion is your shutter speed is half of your frame rate. Okay, so This is one thing that a lot of students, it takes them a while to kind of get this concept. But if we're shooting 24 frames every second, our 180 degree would be, we want to expose our film for half of that time. So every frame that has the potential to be exposed for 1/24 of a second, we're going to expose it for 1/48. And that's going to be, so half of the time our film's going to be exposed, the other half our shutter's going to be closed, and we're going to be moving to the next frame of film. And that's a 180 degree shutter, so half the time. If you picture it like a clock that has, the arms go around 360 degrees, it's half. It goes around half, and that's 180 degrees, and so that's our 1/2 of our frame rate. Part of the reason that they talk about, in cinematography, in video, why we talk about shutter speeds rather than in fractions of a second, like in photography, we talk about them in degrees instead of fractions of a second. You can use either or, they mean the same thing, but in cinema and motion, we're limited on our options because we're shooting so many pictures every second. But originally, with a film camera like that, what they had is they had a mirror inside them. It's a spinning mirror, and the light would come into the lens, it would hit this mirror, and the mirror would be reflected up into the viewfinder. Typically, they made those mirrors so that they were a half circle shape. And as it was spinning around, it was exposing your film for half of the time. The other half of the time, you're able to see what's in the viewfinder. And so that kind of became the standard because most of those shutters were a fixed shutter. It was just a half circle, and so you're only exposing your film for half the time. The other half of the time, you're looking through the viewfinder, and the film is moving up to the next frame, basically. And so that kind of became the look and the standard for natural motion. And it makes sense. We can play with it a little bit with some of these cameras. If you ever notice, like on your phone, if you go outside and you're shooting something outside in bright light, and things look like they're very sharp, and every frame the car is going by, it's frozen in motion, as opposed to maybe at night if you did the same shot and everything kind of like blurs a little bit, doesn't quite look as sharp. That's because your phone is automatically adjusting for that. It's using your shutter speed as a tool to lower the exposure. It's only exposing for that fraction of a second and making everything look really sharp. So in cinema, if you deviate from your half or your 180 degree shutter angle, what you're doing is you're either getting more frozen motion or you're blurring the motion more. And it's one thing that a lot of times it's like the quickest way you can know, okay, that looks very artificial. That looks very like video, like kind of jumpy, is because the shutter speed is too fast. Your camera is compensating, and it's getting this really, really sharp pictures. You want there to be a certain amount of motion blur. If something is moving in the frame, you want to see a little bit of blur with that motion. We can take a look and try some different shutter angles with this. Okay, so in our third thing, the ISO, the sensitivity of the camera, that will determine kind of the noise and grain structure. Typically, a camera has a base ISO, base sensitivity, and if you turn that way up, you're getting a lot more noise. If you turn it down, a lot of times you're losing some quality, you're losing some dynamic range. It's you won't have as much detail in the bright areas in the dark areas. So there's really an optimal setting for your shutter speed, which is, they would say 180 degrees, 1/2 of your frame rate. And then depending on the look you're looking for, your depth of field, you want a certain look. I would say that most people would associate these lower f-stop numbers, a wider aperture, with a more cinematic look. And typically, like when you watch a movie, you're like, wow, like it falls off so beautifully. That's soft in the background. They're sharp in the frame, but it falls off soft in the background, and that's where this wide aperture would come in. So how how would you control your exposure? Let's say you were locked into 1.4. That's the f-stop you wanted. And you were going to use 180-degree shutter angle. And you were going to keep your camera at your base sensitivity. So all of those settings, you decided creatively, we want shallow depth of field. We're going to shoot at f1.4. We want 180-degree shutter angle for natural motion. We're going to leave our camera at our base ISO. How then would you change your exposure? Say you're going out to bright light versus indoors, and you wanted to keep all those settings. How do you think you could control your exposure? Any ideas?
You could have something that blocks light.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. So you can lower your light level somehow. So the easy and most straightforward way to do that, I mentioned earlier, these two cameras have internal filters. They have filters built in. They're neutral density filters. So basically, they go in front of your, in between your lens and your sensor, and just block the amount of light that's in there. That's one reason why these cameras work really well. You can get screw-on neutral density filters for like a DSLR camera, but yeah, being able to control that filter that lowers the amount of light without affecting anything else. That's pretty important. This camera, the Sony here, the FX6, actually has it's actually a very gradual filter system. It's electronic, so it can go from a really dark filter to a really light filter seamlessly by just turning a dial. You can actually use it to change your exposure while the light is actually changing in real time, which is kind of interesting. This camera has a more individual glass filters physically that drop in, and so you can't do that with this camera. But that basically the benefit of that allows you to creatively control your aperture, your shutter speed, and still be able to affect your exposure. Okay, so back to cinematic storytelling. What are some instances where you might want to use a wide aperture? So let's say an f1.4 versus a small aperture, like a f22.
You want to direct your viewers' attention to what you want them to see.
So f1.4 here, it's our wide aperture. f16 here. So in what instance would you lean towards a 1.4? Let's say, what instance would you want a 1.4 aperture?
Maybe during a monologue where someone is saying, what they're saying is very important, so you're just focused on that person and their face.
Yep.
And the opposite, maybe just what's setting the scene for where are we, and this is this city, and you can tell because these landmarks.
Yeah, that's typical. That's kind of what I was going for, is with a very small aperture, you have everything in focus, and that might be where you have a landscape, and maybe you want maybe it's a wide lens, and you have this landscape, and you want the viewer to be able to see, both the foreground, something in the foreground that's in focus, and also things that are off in the distance, everything in focus at once. Whereas your close-up, maybe you just want to bring their attention to just the eyes of the subject, for example. And then what about shutter? So what situations do you think you might want to deviate from your standard shutter angle, where you might want to have a longer exposure versus where you might want to have a very short exposure? There's a couple examples that people talk about a lot. There's the movie Saving Private Ryan. That one, if you're familiar with that, it has a scene where everything, I believe it's where the character is, he's fallen down and he's maybe semi-conscious or something like that, and everything starts to look very very staccato, very sharp, and kind of disturbing. In that case, they used a really fast shutter speed, and kind of use that effect with a lot of like camera movement, with the camera moving around and things moving to give this kind of like unsettling effect. On the other end, with like a lot of blur and going with a very long shutter speed, I've seen that used in films. I don't know a specific example, but sometimes they'll use it for to get in the mind of a person who's maybe tired, or they're under the influence, and things are kind of just like blurring as they look around, and movement starts to kind of blur together and whatnot. So that's an instance where that like longer shutter speed might be used. Okay, so I know this whole concept sometimes can be a little hard to understand and to learn just by looking at it here. But does anyone have any, before we move on, does anyone have any questions on this, or basically understand it? Basically, my kind of overview kind of point was these things all contribute to our exposure, but in addition to the exposure, they also introduce other things into your image to change the look of your image. So each one of those, they're not just an exposure thing, they also change the look, whether it's the depth of field or it's the way that motion is being, the way motion looks in your film. Any questions here? Okay.
I have a basic one.
Basic one, okay.
So are there any specific kind of settings for a camera you're thinking about when you're in a situation like this, where you're filming a TV?
Okay, that's a very unique situation and a good question. Yeah, so typically I always start with the 180 degree rule, and usually my camera's just fixed there, 180 degrees. That's what makes the most sense. That's what looks the most natural. So if my, we'll get to frame rates in a minute, but half my frame rate. If you were to get some strange lines moving up and down on your screen at that, what I would typically do is I would go ahead and try a longer shutter speed and see if that would fix it. And you could go up to, like, say you're shooting 24 frames per second. We'll get to frame rates here in a minute, and you go from 1/48th of a second all the way up to 1/24th of a second, and that's your kind of your maximum shutter speed you can get, right? Hopefully that would eliminate the banding on the TV, but depending on your camera and your settings, you might slowly go from your 180 degree shutter angle, slowly move your shutter angle up and up and up until you see it fix itself, and then maybe that's where you would live, rather than going all the way to a super slow shutter speed, because you're going to get a little more blur and everything. How has it been with your setup? Have you noticed that on a certain shutter speed? Okay. Okay. And you probably would notice it if you change your shutter speed to extremely slow. You'd probably start to notice something. Kind of along those lines, one thing that that I deal with a lot in my work is I shoot cars, and the newer cars have a lot of LED lights on them, and the way that your shutter speed affects the way those lights look is kind of crazy. Some of them, to your eye, they all look just like solid lights. But as soon as you put a camera on it, and depending on your shutter speed, they might start maybe it's like a pattern. Maybe it's like doing some kind of interesting pattern, or it's like flickering and on and off. And every car and every LED on the car is completely different. And so kind of like along the lines of what you're saying, I've had to adjust and kind of deviated from the traditional norms of shutter speed just to compensate for some of those headlights sometimes. And sometimes it means, well, we'd just have to shut some of the headlights off, because they all also operate on different frequencies too. So sometimes you have one set of headlights that are doing one thing, and then the other ones are doing something, and you can't really find that middle ground that works perfectly. But typically, if you have any kind of artifacting like that, it's going to a slower shutter speed is generally going to start to eliminate those things, whether it's a TV or some kind of LED lights. Yeah. All right. So the other basic setting that you'll have on any camera is your color temperature setting. Most cameras have some kind of auto color temperature, so they will automatically adjust given the scene. And a lot of times they'll have these settings where you can manually set your camera to a particular color temperature. And a lot of times they use these exact like icons for different things. So we got the sunlight, it's going to set to a particular color temperature, whereas your incandescent setting is another color temperature. So color temperature is measured in Kelvin degrees, and it goes from very warm with the smaller numbers, like 2000 Kelvin is a pretty warm light. All the way to the other end, we're at like 9,000 on that far end. That's a very cool blue light. So one thing you have to think about is not only your light sources, of course, have a certain color temperature to them, but your camera also has a color temperature setting within it as well. And sometimes that's a little hard for people who are starting out to understand. Those are kind of two separate things, but they work together. So let's just assume you have your color temperature on your camera set to 5200 daylight setting. So you take your camera outside in the daylight, it should look normal. It should be neutral, right? If you bring it indoors and you have these warm tungsten lights that are 3200 Kelvin, for example, your image is going to look really, really yellow, really warm, right? And the way you would compensate for that is you would just take your color temperature setting on your camera from 5200 to 3000. Now those lights, those interior lights that are really warm and yellow, those look neutral now to your camera. But if you take your camera outside now and you leave it set at that 3200 or 33,000 Kelvin, everything's going to look very blue when you go outside, right? Does that kind of make sense? So this is another thing that you have to use creatively. Normally, when your camera is just doing everything automatically itself, it's trying to neutralize that scene, right? And so say you have this beautiful, warm light and it's hitting your subject and you just want to use that because it just has this feeling of warmth and everything. But you bring your camera and you point it at it and it just doesn't look the same. It's probably automatically compensating and it says, whoa, that light is way too yellow, way too warm. I don't like that. I'm going to change your setting. And now it just looks neutral. Now it looks normal. And so that's where you'd want to manually change your color temperature and set it to exactly where you want it. What I typically like to do is I start with my camera in manual daylight mode. So basically it's just, I have it fixed to daylight and it doesn't change depending on the color temperature of the lights or the environment it's in. For me, that will usually, your sunset or your warm light in the evening is going to look a lot more warmer and a lot more colorful. You take it indoors, it's going to look warm. So I think it's a way to tell your story more accurately than letting your camera kind of take control of your color temperature. Any questions on color temperature or any ideas of when you might want to any other ideas of when you might want to manually set your color temperature rather than let the camera kind of decide for you?
If you're trying to take a picture of a sunset.
Yeah.
On your phone, it just kind of washes out.
Mm-hmm.
You never get the same richness of color on your camera.
Yeah, and I think part of that is probably color temperature because it's seeing all that warm. As the sun starts to set, it gets warmer and warmer, and the color temperature of it changes. Your camera is just thinking, oh, I want to neutralize that. That's way too warm, and it's taking out. So part of that is probably also exposure. When the sun gets low, it's like kind of the bright sun looking directly into the camera, and you might want to manually change your exposure to really see more of what you're seeing with your eye. Yeah.
Could you use it for like emotion?
Yeah.
Trying to set that emotion
Yeah.
mood
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's a great point because you can also obviously there's this point where your image is neutral, but do you want your image to be neutral? What if you're trying to set a mood of like someone who's lonely or depressed or something, and in your mind you have this really like cool, kind of like dark, cool look. So, you could do that with lighting, add some like cool lights or whatever, but you can also do that with your color temperature. You can manually change your color temperature of your camera somewhere in here, and now even though your lighting is just neutral, outdoor lighting, but now your image all of a sudden looks very cool, very blue. So that's a good point. That's kind of like where I was going with it, is using that creatively to not necessarily keep everything looking neutral, but give it the warmth or coolness that you want specifically. So if you say you're shooting outdoors in daylight, 5200 Kelvin, that's your light source, right? But you want this cool look. What would you set your color temperature at? So it's actually opposite. Yeah. So if your light source was here, but you wanted it to look more blue, you would actually say you set your color temperature to 4000. Now your camera thinks it's in this warm lighting, but in reality it's just neutral, and so it's going to try to compensate for that and make everything look cooler. So yeah, it's actually like opposite. So the basic 3000 is kind of a middle of the ground. 5000, say 8000. Those might be kind of like kind of middle of those like warm, neutral, cool settings. That'd be something to try next time you pull a camera out. I think even an iPhone with certain apps, you can manually set your color temperature. So go outdoors and set your color temperature to 3000, see what it looks like. Set your color temperature to 8000, see what it looks like. And just experiment with that and see what kind of difference it makes. We can also do that here too when we get some time behind the cameras. Okay, so another concept that can be sometimes takes a while to kind of understand is our frame rates. So we have two different frame rates that we have to think about, and this is, I think, where the confusion comes in for a lot of students. You have your project rate, also called your playback rate. Okay, most cameras will have a project rate, I should say, of like 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, okay? So that's the frame rate that your footage is playing back at. If you're editing it, that's like the frame rate of your timeline. That's how many times per second that picture shows up when you play it back. Typically, for cinematic looking videos, 24 frames per second is the standard. That's what like all the old film cameras from back in the day, they all shot at 24 frames per second. Typically, broadcast is 30 frames per second. So it's a slightly faster frame rate. And then in some cases, 60 frames per second. So those two higher 30 and 60 frame per second frame rates are, I'd say, more for broadcast and less for movies, cinema. So those are project rates. So those are the rate that your camera is playing back, right? And so if you know you're shooting 24 frames per second for your project rate, and then you're shooting 24 frames per second for your capture rate, you'll have normal playback, right? So you're playing back, you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you're playing back at 30 frames per second. Everything looks normal, right? You're shooting at 24, you're playing back at 24, everything looks normal. What gets really interesting is when you deviate from that. So you can shoot your camera at a different frame rate than what it's playing back at. Does that make sense? So in an extreme example, maybe you're shooting 1 frame per second. So you're shooting one picture every second. And then once you have all those frames, you're playing them back at 24 frames per second. So what do you think happens in that scenario where you're shooting one picture every second, but then you play it back at 24 frames per second? Any ideas?
Would it be fast?
Yeah, it's gonna be fast. It's gonna be like a time lapse, right? So it's gonna make everything move really fast because you're only recording 1 frame every second, but you're playing it back 24 times. So it's gonna give you 24 times improvement, increase in speed. So that would be like a situation where you see See those time-lapse shots of like maybe a flower growing, or maybe the clouds are passing by. And so that would be considered a time lapse. So that's shooting with a very slow frame rate, and then playing back at your normal, correct? And then on the other side of that, what would happen if you shot 1,000 pictures every second, but you still played it back at 24? What do you think would happen? Yeah, that's your slow-mo. And so those are like two extreme examples of your speed. It's how your frame rate is going to change your speed. So it's just the two things you kind of have to keep in mind. So normally your frame rate, your project rate 24, your frame rate's going to be 24. Those match. And that's normal. That's just like normal everyday shooting. Everything should look normal. And that's one thing with like cameras at George Fox. They go out, and I always try to make sure that they have them set like that, because if they're not, if say they have their project rate at 24, but their capture rate is 60, it's going to give them slow motion, because when they play back their footage, it's all going to look slightly slower because they captured at 60 frames per second, but they're playing back at 24. So normally those would match. You would select your project rate based on the look you were going for, whether it was a 24 frames per second for like a more cinematic look, or a higher frame rate for more of a maybe a documentary or a news piece. There's been movies that have tried to go with a higher frame rate for playback. It doesn't look very natural. It looks too smooth, too kind of jumpy. But for me, the real fun comes when you deviate from your frames per second, and you can use it as a creative tool to tell a story. So when I started out in still photography, and slowly got into video, but when I got into video, one of the things that was fascinating for me was this here. I was like, okay, now, I was used to just taking a photo, maybe a different shutter speed or a different aperture, but now I'm playing it back, and I can change how many photos I'm taking per second, and I can do these effects like going for a slow motion shot or going for a super fast shot of the clouds moving across the sky. And so when I first got into video, this was something that I thought was super interesting. I would say I rarely shot a normal speed video. I was out there, I would constantly be shooting, 1 frames per second, or 1 frame every minute, for example. Like I started shooting flowers blooming and things like that, and I would set my camera to take 1 frame every minute, and I would let it go for like 2 days. And then it was so fun to see, what is it going to look like, And then on the other extreme, I was like, man, if I could find a camera that could shoot the highest frame rate possible, that would be amazing, because everything would look so slow, and I could experiment with that. So those are two things that I personally really enjoyed and started doing a lot of experimenting with. And I eventually became kind of a expert at doing like the high speed, because there's a lot of nuances and things that come into doing super slow motion footage. So yeah, currently I own a couple specialty high-speed cameras. I didn't bring them today, but they shoot 1,000 frames per second for ultra slow motion. And one of the things I do with those cameras is do a lot of like food and beverage work, where things, are flying through the air or splashing really slow. And so I have a little example I was going to share. So this is a commercial that we shot at my studio for Regal Cinemas. And it was kind of in collaboration with Pepsi, and it airs at Regal Cinemas before the feature movies start. It's a commercial, and they wanted some abstract, and they specifically wanted something cinematic looking. They said they want these abstract cinematic shots of popcorn and sodas, and then we're going to put some movie quotes over it and stuff. So we made a decision to shoot it with high-speed cameras. So we get like the slow motion effect of things moving slow. And so here's the example of some slow motion. Most of this was shot at 1,000 frames per second, and then and then played back at 24. So it has a slow motion. Some of it I think was maybe sped up a little bit in post-production, because you can do that. You can take your footage and speed it up and slow it down a little bit in post-production as well. But most of this was shot originally at 1,000 frames per second. Actually, the final shot was shot in real time. So the final shot was shot at 24 frames per second, and we had the camera kind of drop down for that like final product shot. But all the detail shots were all shot at higher frame rates for that slow motion effect.
What was your crop sensor on that? Was it a 35 or 16?
So the aspect ratio for that was a 2.4 to 1 aspect ratio. Actually a 2.39, and we'll talk a little bit about aspect ratios as well. So that's interesting you kind of picked up on that, because that's like a widescreen aspect ratio. It has the bars, it's letterbox, so it has bars on top and bottom to give it that widescreen look. And so because this was designed to play on movie screens, they wanted to have the same aspect ratio of the movies. And they also wanted to have this, just overall like this kind of cinematic feel. So we actually shot this on some specialty lenses as well. They're anamorphic lenses. And that may be beyond this class, but I'll just talk about it quickly here. I didn't bring an anamorphic lens with me, but basically what an anamorphic lens does is it takes say a square sensor or a square piece of film, and it stretches it to a widescreen look. And they were developed because when people were shooting on film, and they only had so much width on their film, and they run the film through the camera vertically, and they could only shoot so wide. And rather than having to crop it down, only using a small piece of the film, they developed lenses that would actually be able to shoot a bigger piece of film and then stretch it out so they could get this widescreen look without having to crop their film. And then they originally developed the lenses for that purpose, but they also had these like unusual characteristics, and some people would say they're flaws to the lenses, but they've really become what a lot of people consider cinematic looking. And some of those features are like the lens flares. So you can see in this, there's a few times where these like horizontal lens flares, so when the light would come into the lens, it would make like a horizontal line across the picture. Can you think of any movies where you've seen that look? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yes. A lot of like sci-fi movies, and when you're watching a show and you notice it's letterbox, so you notice it has the like black bars on top, or it's very widescreen. Watch for those lens flares, because most likely if you're presenting their film or their commercial in this widescreen aspect ratio, they made a shot it on anamorphic lenses, so you'll notice things like that, like the lens flares. They have these horizontal lines. Other characteristics of anamorphic lenses are they can be soft around the edges, so they have this like they're sharp right in the middle, like your subject is kind of sharp, but on the edges they start to distort and get a little soft, maybe even have a little bit of like barrel distortion, like things that are straight don't look straight anymore. It also, the out of focus areas tend to look a little different too. Usually when you have like an out of focus area with a normal spherical lens, you'll have these circles. You'll start to see like round circles in the background. With an anamorphic lens, because of the stretching, they'll turn oval. So another interesting thing to look for, you might see it in some films, if they're shooting anamorphic lenses, you'll start to see the bokeh or the out of focus areas will start to look oval instead of circular. So that's kind of a fun fact. So anyways, that was an example of shooting slow motion, intentionally changing our frame rate to a faster frame rate for that slow motion effect. There's a lot of fun things you can do with slow motion. We shoot a lot of besides this kind of like food and beverage, sports, like athletes, doing things, slowing down the movement of what they're doing. And to the extreme, I also shoot a little bit of ballistics work for firearms. So like if a ammunition company wants to see the way the bullet interacts when it hits the surface, they'll use like a super high-speed camera for that. The high-speed cameras I own are perfect at 1,000 frames per second, but they don't shoot ultra high frame rates. So if we're doing ballistics, like shooting bullets going through things, I'll rent a specialty, even more specialty high-speed camera that can do up to like several hundred thousand frames per second, even like up to 1 million frames per second. And at that point, you start to see every little thing in like super slow motion, even with extremely fast-moving subjects. Whoops. Okay. Okay, so a few more camera things, and then we'll take a break. So I'll just run through these super quickly because they can make a difference. A few other things to think about when you're, and again, these are all things that you might think about in pre-production. So thinking about before you ever show up and turn on your camera. These are all things that you might think about before your camera ever starts rolling. You know, days before, you're discussing with your team, you know, what kind of look are we going for? What lenses are we using? What kind of camera makes sense? You know, what are all these things we want to think about beforehand? So when we show up, we make sure we have the right camera, the right lens, and we know what settings we're going to set our cameras to. So every camera has a resolution. So it's the number of pixels. Typically, they will list out like how many pixels wide by how many pixels tall the camera shoots. That's your resolution. So, and then you'll also see, so like 1920 by 1080, that's a common resolution. That's a high definition resolution. It's 1,920 pixels wide by 1,080 pixels tall, right? And you'll also see like 2K, 4K, 8K. Basically what that is that's just measured, that's just a kind of a quick hand for your horizontal resolution. So a 2K technically is about 2,000 pixels across the wide end. 4K would be 4,000 pixels across. 8K would be 8,000 pixels across. So that just is going to be how much resolution your picture has. Kind of related to your resolution is the size of the sensor. Although it's not necessarily, like a bigger sensor, a bigger piece of film doesn't necessarily mean it's higher resolution. It can in some cases. But every camera has kind of this like, you know, balance between how much resolution does it have and how big is that the sensor. So besides resolution, how do you think the sensor size might affect the picture, the image? So this might be something like your phone might have a sensor like that big, and this is Christopher Nolan IMAX on the top end. Any ideas of how the physical size of your sensor or your film would affect the picture? You said you liked Christopher Nolan films, right? What do you think makes them special? He's using this like massive format, IMAX, giant. Why do you think that looks different than a phone sensor that's this big?
Probably capturing a lot more fidelity, maybe? I don't know. Detail?
Yeah, all those things for sure. Yeah, more resolution to start with, easy. Did you have an idea back there?
Light gathering.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Format or a full frame sensor usually will gather light better, so better at low light.
Mm-hmm.
Capture more light.
Yeah, on digital sensors, it means like those photo sites that are capturing light, they're bigger and they're able to like bring in more. So those are definitely part of it. The other kind of like byproduct of having a larger sensor is the, like we discussed, the aperture and how that affects your depth of field. That will also, your size of your sensor also has a huge impact on the depth of field in your shots. So typically the larger the sensor, that means that you're going to have much shallower depth of field. It changes the way your focal lengths, we talked about lens focal lengths too, like a wide angle lens might be a certain, like a 35 millimeter. It changes the way that a particular lens looks. So if your lens, 35 millimeter, is making a circle this big, and you have a tiny sensor, it's going to make that lens look a lot more telephoto. You make your sensor huge, and all of a sudden a 35 millimeter lens looks extremely wide. So I think one of the special things about using larger formats, like Christopher Nolan is using an IMAX format, a huge negative, is even with a, like say a 35 millimeter lens, he's still able to get this incredible like depth to the shots where things are extremely sharp and then they fall off really quickly. So, going in, knowing what the size of your sensor that you're using, that's something that's fixed on the particular camera. It's not really something you have control over, but being aware of what's my sensor size on the particular camera that I'm going to be using, and how does that affect the focal length of the lens, and how does that affect the look, the depth of field on the lens? Something to think about. We won't get too much into this because this is even more in the weeds, but codecs and color space. So every camera records to a specific file type or codec, and that's just typically the way that that information is compressed. You might choose to shoot in a RAW format, which allows a lot of changes in post-production. It doesn't bake in those settings, like the color temperature, for example. You may choose to use a compression type that really compresses the file. And what would be the advantage to that? So rather than shooting RAW where all your information is saved, shoot a format where it's compressing, like a JPEG compression or something like that. That's just going to reduce your file size. That's the main benefit of using a compressed format like that. Those are things, just more things to think about. Color space is also just something to be aware of. How is the color being presented on your monitor? So you might be shooting on a camera, it's showing it one way on the monitor, but it might actually be recording it into a slightly different look when you get it in post. It's like, oh, this looks way different. And that's just comes down to like the color space you're shooting in versus the color space you're looking at on your camera, which is maybe a little too much for this. So we won't get super into that. We kind of touched on this a little bit. Our aspect ratios. We shared the example, and you noticed the widescreen aspect ratio on that commercial. That was something similar to a 2.35 to 1. This chart is a little interesting because it doesn't have some very common aspect ratios on it. Obviously, the most common aspect ratio these days is 16:9. So like this TV here is 16 units wide by 9 units high. It's a 16:9 aspect ratio. It's become the standard for most like TV screens. And for that reason, most cameras, when they shoot video, they'll shoot in a 16:9 aspect ratio because it perfectly fills up the screen, right? But some other aspect ratios to be aware of are a 3:2, 4:3. So a 3:2 is typically like a photo aspect ratio. So if you're shooting with a photo camera, maybe it's shooting in this aspect ratio, and then in order to put it on this screen, I'm having to crop it a little bit off the top and bottom, right? This like a 4:3 and more of a square aspect ratio. That was like the old style TV, like a tube TV. They were more of a square format. And then when things kind of went digital, they went to 16:9. But one of the things I've noticed lately is that a lot of filmmakers and even people shooting commercials are using aspect ratios creatively to kind of give a feeling to their work. So, like for example, the widescreen aspect ratio, which kind of annoyingly, there's not a one standard for widescreen aspect ratios. There is a 235, 239, 24 to 1. Those are 3 different aspect ratios, but they all basically mean widescreen, and they're all very similar to each other. So basically, it's 2.4 units across by 1 unit high. And in order to present a widescreen aspect ratio like that on like a TV like this, for example, you would have to letterbox it. So you're going to have black bars on top and bottom. If we were going to present a 4:3 ratio on this screen, we'd have to do the opposite. We'd have to put black bars on the sides and do what's called a pillar box. So letterbox versus pillar box. And it's interesting because people are using those choices very creatively, especially recently. I've noticed a lot of, there's been several films that have come out recently that have actually have multiple aspect ratios within a single film. Have you guys noticed that on any films? Can you think of any specifically?
Yeah, it was more views of like an effect. I remember it was, I think, on The Mandalorian.
Okay.
It was like at the end of the season where they introduced like a really big villain character from the main movies, and then literally the aspect ratio changed in real time to sort of signify the entry of a big cinematic character.
Okay. Huh. Yeah. Yeah. Can you guys think of any situations where you might creatively use a specific aspect ratio in order to help tell the story?
I've seen it in like if it's a modern day and they have a historical flashback.
Yeah.
They use the pillar box, which I was thinking the church history video.
Yeah.
Like that could be a way to indicate this is a flashback, or it's using footage that was filmed maybe in 4:3.
Yeah.
Structured that way.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking, kind of where I was going with that was, yeah, using like different aspect ratios to represent different times. So like maybe the movie takes place in modern times and the show is presented in 16:9, but maybe there's flashback scenes to when a character was younger, and those are presented with the pillar box in 4:3 to kind of represent that era of time when things all looked like a TV screen that was that aspect ratio. And then maybe it has a flashback to a future scene or whatever, and maybe they intentionally go to like a much wider aspect ratio to like, represent like this is kind of the progression of time. Now we have this real widescreen ratio. Yeah, there's a couple directors that are working today and doing a lot of like really interesting things with aspect ratios and mixing aspect ratios within a single picture. And in the past, it was kind of like a film, they would make a decision on, okay, we're going to present in this aspect ratio, and that's kind of what they went with. But now I see it becoming kind of like another creative tool to tell the story a little bit. So the FX6 camera that we looked at, that actually is native 16:9 aspect ratio. So that has your standard TV screen aspect ratio. The Alexa 35 here, this is actually a 4:3 aspect ratio on this camera. Like I had mentioned before, and I was talking a little bit about that camera, that camera was designed to replace a film camera, basically. And so they intentionally went with this more like old school aspect ratio that kind of matches a film camera, allowing you to either crop, you can still crop it to 16:9, or you can use, like we talked about, use the anamorphic lens to stretch that out to like a widescreen presentation. This was actually, some of the other things I've shared are little like bigger productions. This is literally just me and a camera, and that's it. And this was one of these cameras that I was testing actually. So I was testing this camera for my class, and I had a friend who knew this lady named Ann Brucker. She has a pottery studio. Do you know her? Okay. Have you seen this? No. Okay. So I ended up. I was like, hey, I want to test my camera. I need something interesting to shoot. And so he said, oh, I've been working with Ann, her pottery studio. And so I called her up and said, hey, Ann, could I come out and do a camera test and shoot this old camera with you making pottery and stuff? So this is an example of just me and a camera, and this was shot on the 16mm film. And I talked about some of the like characteristics that you get from this like kind of nostalgic vintage camera. And so you'll see a few of those effects here. I used the burns on the beginning and end of the film. It's kind of transitions. It was just after I show it, I'll kind of tell a little bit about what the lighting was. But the lighting was extremely basic, mostly just available light with just me and a camera. And I didn't even plan on, so these don't record audio, no audio. They don't actually sync to audio very well either, so it's not a great camera to record dialogue or interview or anything like that. And I just planned on originally having just some music behind this piece, but her story was so interesting and just hearing her talk and stuff. And so I was like, I don't have any audio equipment, but I used my iPhone, and I just had her I just got some sound bites from her on my iPhone. And then I kind of worked that into the edit. But So basically, this was kind of a proof of concept to test one of these cameras to see if I could shoot a short film. We get about 2.5 minutes of record time with one of these on a 100 feet roll of film. And what I was going to ask my students to do was to shoot their entire film in consecutive order. And so basically, they get their film back, and that's their film. They could put some music over it, they could put some audio, but they're not going to be able to like cut it apart in post and like move things around or have multiple takes. You got to get everything in one take. So that was my challenge for my students, and that's what I decided to do for this camera test. So basically, this was just shot in sequence, in order, and with very little post-production other than adding some sound, and then I ended up recording her voice with my iPhone for some audio. Yeah.
Just a real quick question.
Yeah.
When you shoot the film there, if you were to do editing and you're not for that, you have to continue this. You're actually physically cutting the film and pushing it together.
You can do it that way, and that's
How
like
do you edit that if you were to edit?
what we typically do in my class, and this is like more common today now, other than like physically taping pieces of film together, is you get your film scanned, and then you have a digital file, and from there it's just like any other digital camera. You bring your footage in, and you can work with it. So yeah, my students are getting their film back, but they're also getting a digital scan, and they're doing all their editing digitally.
Is that
Yeah.
how the movies that are shot on film,
Mm-hmm.
is that what they're doing?
Yeah.
Is there
Mm-hmm.
a scan and then there's
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
But
It's
prior, in the old days, they were actually physically
yeah, physically splicing things together. Yeah. That's a really interesting point, because I've heard so many stories recently. It's like so many productions are being shot on film again, and there's all these different like techniques and things that people are trying. And so one thing that's interesting is there's like Christopher Nolan films that are shot on film, and they take the film and they scan it, and then they like do digital editing with it, and then they print it back to film, and then it's actually presented in film. So that's one common scenario. Like I think any film that you're going to watch today that was shot on film, it's digital at some point. It usually goes film to digital and then back to film. But there's other interesting ones like Dune 1 and 2. They were both shot digitally. They're shot on this camera, but then they actually took the digital and printed it to film, and then scanned the film back to digital, just to give it that texture. And so, like, it wasn't shot on film, but it has some of that like texture, and it looks like maybe it was shot on film because, and there's other ways you can add film texture in post-production, like plugins and filters and things like that. But I mean, when you got millions of dollars and you can print it to film and scan it back, you know, it's.
Do you lose any of that? Because the purists are saying, I love that film look.
Mm-hmm.
But in the process, like you just said, there's a digital process,
Mm-hmm.
because they're not actually. I think in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, they actually, when they did the news, they shot it on film.
Yeah.
They actually processed it, et cetera, et cetera. That's what the guys I worked with told me.
Yeah.
About.
Mm-hmm.
But do they keep that original film look, even though halfway in the process they're digitally scanning it? Does it keep that film look, or does it lose a little bit of that?
I think it keeps that, and I think and what it does is it gives them a base. So like they shot it on film, they have this certain look and this aesthetic and this grain to it. And then when they're doing their digital work, like a lot of times, like maybe they're doing, adding things in post-production, but they also have this like base look to work from. And so they're matching everything to that film look, you know, like they have to add a car in post instead of just like the car looking kind of digital or whatever, like they're matching it to what they already have. So when they're adding things and taking things away in post-production digital, I think they're using that like base of film to like do those things. And so I think it retains that look, and that's kind of the goal. I think it's going to retain that look. But yeah. All right, so I'll play this real quick. Oops. You can see some of it's an overscan. So we scan the whole piece of film, and so it has some like imperfections on the edges that maybe you would crop out, but To me, it just adds to some of that like texture. It also has kind of like a vignette on the corner a little bit. It has a certain amount of grain to it. It's a pretty fine grained film, but it is 16 millimeters, so it's got a.
One of the wonderful things about pottery is just we have so many analogies from scripture, and I feel like the potter and the clay, as you're in my hands, as clay is in the hands of the potter, so you are in mine. And how the more that we are pliable, the more we are centered as God comes into our life and really directs us and shapes us and helps us become all that He created us to be. There's just a joy that comes from that, but also those lessons of the potter where we do need to be centered, to be still, and to have a sense of working with the clay is working with the potter with the clay to create an amazing image that's going to come out of that.
And I used my phone to record some of the sounds of the.
What I love about creating on the potter's wheel is the whole process from cutting a chunk of clay off the brick, wedging the clay so it kind of wakes up, gets pliable, ready to be used on the potter's wheel, and then going to the potter's wheel. And sometimes I have a plan. Typically I do these days, but I never know exactly what my mugs are going to look like. And so just that whole process of approaching the wheel and then a little bit of anticipation on what's going to come out. I'm Ann Brecker. I'm a figurative artist living in Sherwood, Oregon. I create art in drawing, painting, sculpting, as well as pottery.
And there's some of that film burn at that. So it had to be timed pretty well to get that, the ending and everything. So that was just an example that was shot on this 16 millimeter film, just to kind of give you some idea of that aesthetic.
Has a fixed lens, or does that interchange the lenses?
You can change the lenses out on these cameras, yeah.
What millimeter was that you shot on? Do you know?
That was actually a zoom lens. So I had the luxury of having a 10 millimeter to 100 millimeter zoom lens. So on these 16 millimeter is a pretty small format sensor size wise compared to like these larger digital sensors. So that gives them the ability to make a lens that has a pretty good range on it that's covering that small sensor. So yeah, the 10 to 100 is a pretty standard zoom lens for a 16 millimeter camera. This lens on here now is a fixed, it's actually an anamorphic fixed lens. So this is a 1.5 times anamorphic, not the lens I shot that one, but this will give you that widescreen aspect ratio on a more square piece of film on this one. So it just happens to have that lens, but they're interchangeable. This is a kind of an aftermarket mount that allows me to put lenses from like these cameras on this camera. I can still put the older lenses on it as well, but having that flexibility to kind of put whatever lens on it. So yeah, that was very simple, and we're getting into lighting, and I'll just quickly, since we just watched that, lighting on that one was just one light. It was an LED, like one of these, in a box, in a soft box, and it was just mostly using the natural available light in the studio. I did turn off the overhead lights and just let the natural light from the windows come in. But I specifically wanted those lights to be behind her. And so we positioned so a lot of it was more about positioning my subject than actually positioning the lights. So we positioned the wheel and her so that all the windows were kind of behind her. And then I used that individual light, and I didn't want it to like overpower that natural light coming in. And so I used it, I had it camera left. So if I'm standing behind the camera, it was on the left side, so camera left, and it was back quite a ways. Just so it felt like it was still coming from those windows. So very non-traditional lighting setup. And what we talk about today, we'll go over kind of like a typical lighting setup of like what a normal lighting setup might look like, but then how maybe you would not do that. In what situations you might want to use a standard lighting setup and what situations where you might want to do something totally different. So just quickly, when we think about lighting, I like to think about the three basic characteristics of light. The direction of light, how the light is diffused, and the color of the light. So basically everything comes down to those three things. There is the intensity or brightness of the light. Really, that doesn't necessarily affect your picture in the end, because usually you're compensating for that, right? The only way that the intensity of the light would affect your image is if you have multiple lights at different intensities. And then you're talking about contrast ratios, one light in relation to the other light. But when it comes down to it, it's really just those three things. So when we talk about light, we'll typically talk about the direction of light as either like front or back light, a side light. But there's infinite places in between there. When we talk about diffusion, we're talking about how hard or soft a light is. So for example, outside in the bright sun, that's a hard light source, right? The characteristics of a hard light source are going to be, it's going to be distinct shadows. It's going to leave a very hard, contrasty shadow, very defined shadow. But from there, you can diffuse that light. Or say a cloud comes in front of your sun. Now you have a diffused light, right? Your shadow will be a lot softer. It won't be as much contrast. And so that's diffusing light. And in lighting, especially in studio lighting, we have so many different ways to diffuse the light or to modify those lights, right? And then lastly, the color of light, which we talked about a little bit about color temperature in relation to cameras, where you would set your camera to basically get a neutral light. But your light can also take on different colors as well. These lights here that the church owns, these are bicolor lights. I'm sorry. Well, you just told me that. The church doesn't own them. I still have a big smile on your face there. These allow you to change the color temperature from, what was it? We were just looking at it, like 2800 to...
I think it's like 32 to 65.
Yeah. So it kind of gives you that basic range from like an incandescent, like warm interior light to matching daylight, basically. And so you have that control right on these lights. Besides color temperature, where these ones just have that color temperature setting, you can also, make a light like a bright color too. You can put a gel in front of it, which is a plastic piece of colored material. Maybe you put a red gel. Now the light looks like it's bright red. Color temperature will never quite get you to those bright colors, so that's where you use a gel or certain LEDs that have the ability to do that. Okay, so those are our three basic properties of light, and this is our basic 3-point lighting setup, which is somewhat like what we have over here. I brought a whole lighting kit with me, and I was going to set up a 3-point lighting setup, but we're fortunate to be in this space today, and they basically have a 3-point lighting setup here. So this is what a 3-point lighting setting kind of looks like. And you said maybe after the workshop we can get up and actually stand up and play with some of these lights and turn them on. So in a lighting setup, especially a 3-point lighting setup, you typically have 3 lights. You have your key light, so that's called the key. That's the main light that's lighting your subject. The second light is your fill. So this is our fill here. And this fills in the shadows. Typically, like we're talking about shooting a portrait or an interview, you have your key, and the opposite of your key is where you have your fill light. That fills in the light on the other side. And then the third light you have is your backlight. Backlights, sometimes they're also called a kicker, a rim light, or hair light. There can be lots of different things. So a 3-point lighting setup is basically those 3 lights. And then they've kind of found that's kind of the standard. From there, you can go crazy. You can add a background light. I think that backlight is kind of acting as a background light as well, because it's lighting the back of the set. In some situations, maybe you would have a specific light that's only lighting the background, and maybe one that's more of just that backlight. That's just kind of a kicker on the back edge of the subject. So that's in a nutshell, that's your basic 3-point lighting. You got your key, you got your fill, you got your backlight. Now, typically, your fill light is going to be less than your key light. So you start with your key. That gives you your kind of like your base exposure. Your fill light actually doesn't even need to be a light. In this case here, we have an actual light fixture to serve as our fill. A lot of times the fill light is just a reflector board, for example. I make these bead boards out of insulation from Home Depot. Basically just cut them in half, a 4x4 foot piece of bead board, and it's white on one side and silver on the other side. It's super simple. Those are great for all kinds of things, just kind of a DIY setup. But a lot of times I'll use a bead board, like a 4x4 panel, as my fill light. And that'll just reflect some of the light from the key onto the subject. It gives you kind of a very natural fill light without having to introduce another whole like light source there. And then your backlight can kind of come in different ways. Sometimes your backlight is just hitting one side of the back of your subject. That's pretty typical, just to kind of give some separation between the subject and the background. Sometimes it might come from like a higher angle straight behind, or it might come from it could come from either side a little bit too. So that's like the basic 3-point lighting. I think when I'm done with slides, we can go over there and turn some of those on, and we can kind of take a look at what those different lights look like. But I would say that if you're lighting for a cinematic look, you're probably never going to use a typical 3-point lighting look. And this was a picture I found that kind of illustrates it pretty well. And this is like, I think this is more typical for a movie scene and what you would, how you would kind of deviate from a typical 3-point lighting setup. So, so in a 3-point lighting setup, you have your key, your fill, your background light. But when you're lighting something for a movie scene, the way that I explain to my students and the way that seems to tell the story the best is to use a combination of practical lights and motivated lighting. And I'll explain what those two terms mean, and then this is a really good example of that. So a practical light source is anything that appears in the frame. So anything you see on camera is a practical light source. A motivated light is any light that looks like it's coming from your practical. So in this case here, we have this very symmetrical frame, and I really like the way that it uses these 3 practicals. So these 2 lamps are considered practical lights. This laptop is another practical light. And the lighting is set up to, and I don't know for sure, I'm assuming this is how most of the time it works in movies. These lamps aren't actually lighting her face like that. The lighting that was set up outside of the frame is just mimicking what you would think those lamps are doing, right? Same thing with the laptop. I'm not 100% sure, but my guess is this is a pretty big feature. There's probably some type of small LED here that's actually lighting the front of her there. And so that's acting as a motivated light for that practical laptop. And you can see the way this really like deviates from a 3-point lighting setup, because our key is down here. I would consider this the laptop light, our key light. And then you don't really have a fill. I guess you could argue that these are either background lights or fill lights, but they don't really follow that formula. Just imagine for a minute that that instead of using these lamps and this laptop to motivate the lighting, that we just came in and put a 3-point lighting setup on that, and what it would look like compared to how it does. This really tells the story and makes sense for the location and the lights. So I'd also say that these lamps may not have necessarily been in that spot. One thing that a cinematographer does is puts practical lights in the frame to justify their lighting, and that's a big part of one of the things they do. So if they have a scene and there's no practical lights in it, they probably would add those, because then that becomes the basis of how they're going to light it. And then once this might be our opening shot. Once you crop in, you're going to continue with this lighting, but you're already kind of with that understanding of, okay, there's two lamps, there's a lamp on each side, there's this laptop, and that's where our lighting is coming from. Cool? Does that make sense? Any questions on that? That's one thing I really enjoy. I like doing like a traditional lighting setup is not super interesting to me. I really enjoy these, like the puzzle of a scene and then adding practical lights and then making the lighting up depending on where those practicals are placed. One thing you see in a lot of film too is the practicals. Obviously they're in the frame, so they're usually behind the subject somewhere, and they could be in front, but a lot of times they're behind, which means a lot of your lighting is coming from behind. And I feel like that kind of lighting really makes things look more cinematic, I would say. The lighting that's not, doesn't look like there was a light placed to light the person. The lighting is just part of the environment, and it kind of gives that illusion that the lighting is just a part of the environment. Okay, so common mistakes, and these are all kind of three, like basically the same thing. These are common mistakes that I see, even myself. I kind of find myself doing these things sometimes, and I have to like kind of intentionally, okay, now I just need to break it down and be a little more simple. Over lighting, making the scene look unnatural, rather than using practicals and then motivating the light. I have this tendency a lot of times, and I try to steer away from it, as coming in and like, okay, cool, like put a light there, put a light there, put a light there, and we'll start shooting, In reality, what works better, I found, is start with what's already there. Even maybe like turn off overhead lights, look at your windows, look at what lamps are there, and kind of like come up with a lighting plan before ever turning on a light. Kind of find out what lighting is already there that's working, and how we can kind of use that in the overall lighting setup. There are several directors of photography who really share that. I don't know if you're familiar with Roger Deakins, but he's very much this like natural lighting kind of cinematographer. He shot like 1917, a lot of big like beautiful films and stuff, and he relies almost entirely on practical light sources, and he even uses most of those practicals as actual sources. Occasionally he'll add to kind of accentuate, but like using candles just as they are, or using only a window light and kind of working with that. So yeah, sometimes less is more. And I would say another mistake, using 3-point lighting. Even though it's like, you go to film school, and the first thing we talked about in lighting is, here's how you do a 3-point lighting. And then you get out in the real world, and it's like, no, you shouldn't do that. I do think there is a place for 3-point lighting. I think in a scenario like this, where you're shooting an interview, or you're working on a documentary or doing a portrait or something like that, it's definitely like a great basis to start, and then can kind of adjust from there. But typically, if you're lighting in an environment for like a drama, you're usually not using 3-point lighting. But I do see a lot of students who do kind of the same thing. They come in and, okay, here's my 3-point lighting setup. I'm setting it up. And it's kind of like, well, why is there a kicker? Why does that doesn't make sense in this scene? Because there's no lights back there to make that. So why would that be there? So just kind of, starting with a basis, maybe a 3-point lighting, but making it make sense for the scene. Adding lights rather than subtracting them, kind of the same thing in all these, but there's a lot of different ways to do subtractive lighting. I think people, especially starting out, always assume that if they're lighting, they're adding lights. You know, we got to put a light there, we got to put a light there. But you can also create beautiful lighting without adding any light, with only subtracting light. And that's really common, especially outdoors. If you're shooting an outdoor scene, especially maybe in the sun or something like that, most of the time what you're doing with lighting is, rather than trying to get one of these lights and turn it on as bright as you can to kind of compete with the power of the sun, what works a lot better is to maybe start by diffusing the sun, putting up like a sheet or some diffusion fabric. So start out by diffusing that sun, and then maybe you add a piece of black foam core on the side of your subject, and that's like actually kind of absorbing light from that side, and so that's giving you a little more definition, a little more contrast on that side of your subject. So there you go. You go from like horrible bright outdoor sunlight to a really nice looking shot, and all you had is diffusion, and then like call it like a negative. So you're taking some light away on one side. So that's an example of a really simple lighting setup that's subtracting light rather than adding it. Okay, any questions on any of that? It's just kind of like overall like kind of philosophy with lighting. Common types of lighting. And this is really interesting to me because I've seen this like in the last 10 years, things have changed in like the lighting fixture as far as like equipment with lighting has changed so much in the last 10 years. Way more than like camera technology or anything else has changed. And it's all been about because of the LED lights, the revolution of LED lights. These are pretty much all LEDs, right? Everything we see here. 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have seen near this many LEDs. There was probably a few, maybe some of these panels were that old, but we were using a lot more tungsten, so like typical filament bulbs. We were using HMIs, which is like an arc, like a very like a gas arc type lamp, or we're using fluorescents. Now pretty much I'd say fluorescents are done with. No one uses fluorescents. I don't even think you can buy a fluorescent fixture anymore. So fluorescents are gone. HMIs are used very rarely. They're pretty much only used if you need a really big light and you need to compete with the sun, or you need to something is a really massive light and it's blasting something to make it look like the sun. Maybe that's where you might use an HMI. But some of the LEDs are getting so bright and so good that they're kind of replacing HMIs for the most part. Tungsten lights, those have kind of held on a little bit. I think maybe a little bit because of like the nostalgia of using the old camera and the like special look you get from using an old camera. There is like a look to like a tungsten light or we call them hot lights. They're really warm. They're also warm color temperature too. So today, I would say you're pretty much going to see these two light fixtures. You're going to see the two types of LEDs, which would be like a panel light, like these up here. They're an array, usually like in a wider array of LED lights. Or you'd see like they call them like a COB, or just more of a traditional light. It makes an LED array, a smaller LED array that kind of mimics the look of a single bulb. Whereas these are kind of already a wide array and they're a little softer. A COB LED is a small array of LEDs that looks like a single light bulb. And that's what they have here in these fixtures. So advantages and why LEDs have kind of taken over. They're very bright for the wattage. They don't use as much power, but they can also be they're also very controllable. Like I mentioned, you can change your color temperature on them. You can make them warmer or cooler. Whereas a lot of these other lighting technologies where one fixed color temperature and you can't change that at all unless you add gels or start. These can change your color temperature with just a twist of a knob. So they're brighter, they're cooler, they're very easily controllable, and they've just they kind of make sense. They've kind of taken over the industry. And I don't know, I would say if you're interested in looking at buying like a lighting kit or something like that, probably gonna be LEDs, and they make a lot of kits that come in like a case. You can get, usually it's like 3 LED lights come in a kit, and it usually has some stands and maybe like a few modifiers like a softbox or some other kind of accessories. That's a good way to kind of get started and get into lighting. The other benefit is they basically never burn out. With light bulb based fixtures, you're constantly having to like replace the light bulbs when they go out. And sometimes some of those were very expensive, like with HMIs are very expensive to switch. So I mentioned lighting modifiers. So you have your basic light. There's so many different ways that you can change your, tools that you can use to change the look and quality of your light. A lot of, what we're doing is softening the light. So things like these soft boxes you see here, they just diffuse the light to different degrees. They're different. You can see they're different shapes. Other light. Let's see. There's a Fresnel back there, right behind your head there. So that has a Fresnel attachment on it. That's another attachment that would go on the end of an LED light. And basically it's like a glass, looks like a lighthouse glass lens. Light goes through, that focuses the light a little bit. So if you want to get a little bit harder light out of an LED source like that, you might add a Fresnel. Barn doors, these lights up here have barn doors on them. Those are just on the sides of the light and allow you to shape the light a little bit to cut the light off of certain areas. You can kind of window them down and out. Similarly to like a Fresnel, a spot attachment. So you can actually put a lens. It's kind of like what you'd see on like a lot of stage lighting uses spot attachments where it has an actual lens that mounts on the front of the light. It allows you to focus the light and narrow it down to just a specific area. They make those for LEDs as well. All types of scrims, nets, diffusion. Scrims are kind of going away with a lot of the tungsten lights, but a scrim goes in front of your light to kind of cut down the intensity of the light. With LEDs, they have the ability to just turn them down and up, so you don't really need the kind of scrims that would go in front of a light to make them dimmer. Solids, flags, cutters, it's all kind of the same thing. Basically, it's like I mentioned earlier, having a black board, or they make them in frames. It's just a piece of black fabric or a piece of black core. You can use that to block the lighting off certain areas. And then bounce or reflector, I mentioned that earlier too. Like I use these, I should have brought one with me, pieces of beadboard from Home Depot that you can use as reflectors and kind of move them in. Gels, color, or diffusion gels going in front of the light to change color if you don't have that ability in the fixture itself. I was curious if any of you, I mentioned my DIY boards that I make at Home Depot. Have any of you guys used any DIY modifiers for lighting or anything? Yeah? Tell us about it.
I once did like a cutout of like a cardboard box.
Uh-huh.
Just, like painted it and just like hung it up to kind of
Okay.
because I was like I didn't have the stuff that I needed to do it, but it worked and it was like really fun.
Was it like bouncing off it, or was it used? Okay.
Bounce off to be able to get like the
Mm-hmm.
look that I wanted
Yeah.
for a photo shoot I was doing. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I use mirrors quite often, and sometimes mirrors are really great for like DIY lighting tools, because a lot of times you can get a mirror up in a place where you might not be able to get a light source, but if you can shine a light up at that mirror, and then that mirror is reflecting back onto your subject or your set, it's a kind of easy way to get a light into a place where maybe you wouldn't be able to get a light, but you can fit a mirror, because the mirror is just totally flat. Maybe even stick it to the wall or stick it to the ceiling, and you can just like bounce your light into that mirror. I see a lot of times people will use even like tree branches and things like that to shape their light. You know, if you're outdoors, maybe you want the light to not just completely light the side of the subject, but you know, maybe you want it kind of dappled, like it looks like it's coming through the tree naturally. So you can just take tree branches and hold them up in front of your light. So that's something I've done. Any other DIY ideas for lighting? Yeah, it's a white sheet. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those work great for like even like windows, hanging up over your window if you have like some direct sun coming in, but maybe you don't want that hard light, you know, coming in the window. Hang a bed sheet over the window and just kind of diffuse that light. Yeah.
I was going to say in your pottery one, if that was a project that you shot with multiple cameras and you're showing a wide shot, you could put the light outside the window.
Yeah.
If you want to show the window,
Mm-hmm.
have the light accentuate the window light
Mm-hmm.
without showing the light stand.
Yeah.
The light, if you had another camera or something.
Yeah.
That's something.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's super common to, especially lighting a whole like interiors, to have all the lights actually outside, you know, shining through the windows. Just gives you that more in that natural look where they're actually coming from their practical sources. Okay, wow, we are basically at time. So I think what I'm going to do is just quickly go through these last few slides, and then we'll have a little time, if you have time to stick around, to maybe do a little hands-on. You can play around with any of the cameras. Maybe we'll turn some lights on. But I don't know how soon we have to like be totally out of here. I kind of thought this might happen, but things just typically go a little longer than what you think. So, okay, so with this section, as I mentioned before, our first section, that was kind of like pre-production. Those things to think about before you ever set foot on your set with your camera. This section is more about like after you're there and you start recording, how are you like using your camera? So another thing I love about cinematography is composition. And we could spend a whole 3 hours or more, maybe we'll spend a whole week on just like talking about composition and practicing that, because it's super fun. But the three, and I do a photography class, and we always started with composition, and the students just love it. But the three things I like to think about personally when I'm thinking about composition are those three. Rule of thirds, you know, breaking, it's like a typical like photo composition kind of tool where you break your frame up into thirds, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and you place your subject in on one of those axes, one of those points in the frame. Leading lines, so like in this example here from The Shining, all those lines kind of leading to the subject, leading your eye in there. And then using frames, so using something in your scene to frame your subject. Those three we could spend the whole 3 hours like looking at examples and talking about those three. But those are three things that I kind of keep in my mind when I'm out shooting. And I feel like it leads to the creativity, especially like using frames or using foreground. If you're out shooting something and it just seems kind of plain, kind of boring, kind of normal, find something to shoot through. You know, find a little hole that you can shoot through and just add some interest to your shots. Basic camera movements. Again, we could spend a whole 3 hour class just on camera movements, and we do this at George Fox. But we have tripods here. Those are our most basic camera movement tools, which allow pan and tilt. So if you're ever on set and you're talking to the crew, use those terms. Tilt, we're tilting up and tilting down. Pan, we're panning right and panning left. If you use any words other than that, they might not know what you're talking about, or you have to kind of explain yourself a little more. Roll is basically turning the camera on its sides. So rolling it back and right. A lot of tripod heads don't allow you to roll. It's kind of an unusual type of camera movement. Dolly, There's all different kinds of camera dollies. I think I have some pictures of them in the next slide. But a dolly shot usually is pushing camera in or pulling camera out. There's all kinds of tools that you can use to do a dolly shot. A boom or a jib shot is going from low to high or high to low. And usually you would say boom up or boom down. If you're talking about bringing the camera up and down, you're booming up and down. In and out, you're dollying in and out. Other types of maybe less traditional camera movements would be a tracking shot. A tracking shot is following your subject. You could do a tracking shot with a pan. Most typically tracking shots are moving with your subject. Handheld is usually just more of a random kind of camera movement. I think handheld works great for some things, but it really needs to be intentional. I see a lot of people using handheld just because it's easy, but I really think it needs to be intentional for a reason why you're hand-holding, not just because it's simple and easy. Zoom is not really a camera movement, but it's the lens. You're zooming in and out. And then, of course, with zoom, there's all kinds of fun things you can do, like crash zoom is a fast move in or a fast move out. You can do those crash zooms. And then the dolly zoom, everyone's favorite shot to try to get, which has been in several movies where you're dollying the camera in or out and you're zooming at the same time. It's this very strange effect. A lot of times it was used in Jaws. I think maybe that was one of the original movies that used that shot where it camera pushes in and goes wide at the same time. And the background, he stays the same in the frame, but the background kind of moves out. It was this kind of realization moment when he was looking out over the ocean. And then locked off or static. That's not moving the camera at all. And it's somewhat like an overlooked tool, I think, that I always appreciate it that when I see a cinematographer intentionally use a static shot for impact in a film. Just some different rigs. I mentioned some of the camera movements, and there's so many different rigs you can use to do different kinds of camera movements. It's a little bit overwhelming to some. It's kind of partly where I've made kind of my career as a specialty camera guy is these specialty rigs, especially the more specialty stuff like helicopters and cars and things like that to move the cameras in certain ways. To wrap up, a few resources that I use and that I mentioned to my students on YouTube. Studio Binder, they have this is a frame from a Studio Binder video, and this is one that would have been fun to watch with y'all. The reason I like Studio Binder is they show a lot of real-world examples. They show a lot of frames or scenes from films and then explain what they're doing and how they're using that to impact the story. So I love Studio Binder on YouTube. It's a great tool to learn more. You can probably look up any subject that we talked about today, and there's a whole video on Studio Binder of more in depth on how to do it. OMPA is Oregon Media Professionals Association. It's a group in Portland that they do workshops and kind of meet and greets. They have a website of people in the state who do all these different jobs that we talked about. So it's a good resource to find people and connect with people in the industry locally. Kerner Camera, it's a rental house in Portland. So they rent out cameras like these. It's also just an interesting place if you ever want to go somewhere and just kind of look at what they're doing and what's going on there. Most productions that come through the state go through Kerner Camera at some point, and they do all their camera prep there. So they'll, the camera assistants will spend a whole day prepping and building these cameras in their shop there in Portland for different productions. And then staying in touch with me, I'm on Instagram. I have one for my Via Films business, my personal one, and then I have an Instagram account that's just dedicated to Bolex cameras. So that's just some tutorials on how to use them, and I need to do more, but I'm just kind of starting it out. So it's projects that were shot on Bolexes or little how-to tutorials on using those cameras. And then my websites as well. So that's basically that's my slides for today. I know we're a little over time. I apologize for that. If there is any extra time to stick around, you can have some hands-on with the cameras and maybe look at the lights as well. So.